Welcome back to my channel. So today in this video we are going to learn how we can parse JSON data in Dart or Flutter projects. So in this video we are going to parse JSON in Dart so that we can actually know how the parsing project process works, and in the next video we are going to implement this parsing technique in our Flutter application. So for this episode or for this video, I have created a Dart project using the command dart create and the project name. So the project name here is a JSON parse, and the source code of this entire project will be accessible from my GitHub repository, and the link of that repository will be given in the description below. You can get it from there. So without wasting any time, we'll start our today's video. So for this video we have different JSON datas of different types. That is, first we have a simple, then we have a little complex, and the complexity goes on rising. So we have targeted it as each level. So and the file name will be in the same level 1, level 2 dot and so on, so that all the levels code can be accessed by you guys. So now I've created a level 1 dart file, and we have just a void main, that is main function, which prints, if I run, which prints hello world. So we can see it's printed hello world. So now what we'll do is we'll create a new function and we'll say get data. So this function is used to get the data, and the data, what we are going to do in the level 1 is we are going to use this data. So we'll just copy this and we'll create a new variable which says data, and we'll paste it over here. So we have our new data over here, and now if we just go through this data, we have a data of string and dynamic over here. It's dynamic because on the left hand side we have the string, and right hand side we have a string, and we have the integer as well. So if I just reformat this, so you can see on the left we have a string, and we have a string, and we have some integers. So the first thing while we are going to pass JSON is that we need to make a class that is a skeleton of the data. So the data contains a skeleton as ID, name, and score. So first let's create a new class, and for this we'll just name the class as student. So the student has ID in the form of string, so we have a ID. So the student has a name in the form of string, and we have a score in the form of int. So we'll just add this, and for this we'll create a constructor. So we have this dot id, we have this dot name and score. So we have created a simple student class which has got three variables, that is id, name, and score, to keep note of the id, name, and score of the student. And for that we have created a constructor as well. So now we are going to create a factory method, and the factory method contains a student, and we are calling the same class, and from there we are calling something called as from JSON function. So this function takes some value that has to be formatted or passed and returned. So here the data is of the type map of string comma dynamic, because we are going to pass this data, and the type of this data is string comma dynamic. So we'll name it as student data, what you are going to pass. And now we have to return the data in the form of class what you have created here. So so we can return student from here. So what value does the student return? The student returns a value id, name, and score. So from where do we get the value id, name, and score for each student? So that value will be stored inside st data. So now we can create id, and id is stored in st of data, and we need to pass id. So this gives the id that is stored in the student data. So now we want the name, so in the same way is data of name. And finally we want a score, so score will be st data of score. So we have these three things. So we have done with the dot from JSON function. So we have created a student class which represents the model of this data. So it takes ID, name, and score, and from there we have created a from JSON function which takes in the data and returns the student class. So now inside the get data function, now we need to return turn the student. So we need to pass a student JSON data, and we have to show that in our app. So for that we are going to call student from JSON. From the student function we are going to call the JSON. And now where is the student data? The student data is stored in the variable data. So now we have passed. So whenever we call a function, the student.from JSON data is called and the value will be returned. So now we can say like we can create a new variable and we'll store the data that we get from the get data function. And now let's try to print the value. So what value we make it? So now let's try to run this application. So I've just pressed run. So we can see we have got this instance of student, but what we wanted is we wanted ID, we wanted name, we wanted score. So now how to get the value from instance of student or instance of any class? So if you get the value in the terminal as instance of any class or instance of anything, then you can get it from the dot operator. So if you just check the student class, we have something called ID, name, and score. So now this value represents the instance of a student. So if I just press if I just add a dot, if I try to add name, now if I try to run this program once again, so instead of the student instance we need to get the name of the student. So in this way what we can do is we can print the name. So we'll just print the score. So for that we are going to say from the student class, that is value, we are going to print out the score. So now if I run this application right now, we are getting score, that is what we are getting over here, and the name. So this is a simple way how we have generated. So now let's head on to our second level. So if you see the first level, we just had a simple JSON data which contained a string and on the left, and which had the data of string or the normal integer thing. So but in the second level what we have is we have a city as Mumbai, and the streets we have a list. So now it's not the list is not as simple as integer or string. So for this we need to create something else. We have to add some extra functionality. So let's see that how we are going to do in the level 2. So now let's copy this, and instead of level 1 dot I'm going to create inside the bin, I'm going to create a new folder, a new dart file, and we'll name it as level 2 dot. So now we have a level 2, we'll just say void main and we'll print it as level 2. So now if I run this, we need to get level 2 in our debug console. So we have got level 2. So now in the same over here, I'm going to create the same function get data, and this time the data will be the copied one, this one. So we have this data over here. Let's format this again. So we have a city which is a string, and we have a streets which is a list of string. So now what we can create is we can create a new class, and let's say it as address. And now this has the value final. We have a string city, so it is of a type string, and we have streets. So final, it's a list of string. If you see, it's a list of string, so we create a list of string and we have streets, right? So now it's time to create a constructor, as we have created before. So we have this dot city and we have this dot streets. So we have created. So in the same way as we have done the previous, for this also we are going to create a factory method that is from JSON. So now it should be address dot from JSON. So now we'll call this as address data. So we are passing some data over here, and now in the same way we need to return the address, and over here the city will be address data and we'll say city, and now we have the streets. So let's try what happens if we just pass the streets as address data of streets. So let's check what are we going to get, whether we are going to get output. So now what we need to do is, as the same way, we need to return the address function. So we'll call the address dot from JSON and we are going to send the data. And now we need to call this get data. So these things are same because it will be a practice for you. So get data, and now if I try to print the value, let's see what values we get. So let's run this. So we have got instance of address, but the thing is we cannot directly add the streets, so we need to convert that into a list. So let's try to convert this into a list. We need to get the add data, and we need to get the streets from there, and we need to cast that into a string. So now we need to pass the streets over here, and this should be variable. So we have streets, we have got the streets, list of streets, and we are casting it to a list of string. So then only we can pass that to the street function. So now let's try to get the print from the value. We'll try to print the city, and we'll try to print the value of streets as well. So now let's try and let's see what output we get. So we get Mumbai and address 1 and address 2. So now again you can have index over here of 0, so you're going to get the address 1 itself and not address 2. So you can see we have got the city, that's Mumbai, and we have got the first address. So we have got the address over here. So this was with the second level. So let's go on to the next level. So in the next level, what we have is we have a JSON data, and inside that we have another JSON data. So now we are going on with the level 3. So now I'm going to create a new file which says level 3 .guy. So if you guys have any doubts or any regards with this, how we are going to pass JSON, you can share them freely down in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer all your queries. So let's create a simple main function which says that it's level 3. So this states we are in level 3. So now as the same way we'll say get data, and we'll have data as specified. So let's format this so that it will be easy for us to understand. So we have format card data. So now whenever we have nested data, that is one JSON format type inside the another JSON format, so what we need to do is we need to make two classes, one class referring to this property JSON data, and the next data is for the entire data itself. So now what we need to do is, first we need to make a class for the nested data. That is, for we need to make a class for the property. So what we can do is we can create a class called property class property, which takes two values in the form of double, that is final double. We have width and we have final double breadth. So let's create a that is a constructor for this. So we have this dot width and we have this dot breadth. So now again we need to create a factor method for this class so that we can return it in the form of a property class. So we'll make a factory function which says property dot from Json and it takes in a value of the type map of string comma dynamic, and we'll say prop data. And now we need to return this data in the form of property class. So the property class will have the width as prop data of width, and we have the breadth as prop data of breadth. So this will return a property class with the values which contains width and breadth. So now it's time to create a class for our outer JSON data. That is, we'll name it as shape. So we'll name the class as shape, which takes a string value, that is shape name, and we'll create it as shape name. And final, we have a value of the class property, and we'll say it is a property, and we can name it as property itself. So let's create a constructor for this. So we have shape name and we have property. So we have constructed a constructor as well. So now it's time to create a factory method for this as well. So now we need to call shape dot from JSON, and we need to pass the data type map of string comma dynamic map. We have string comma dynamic, and we'll say it as shape data so that there will be no confusion with the variables. So now we need to return the shape class. So as usual, for the first, that is, it's directly a string, so we can say that as shape name will be shape data of shape name. So this variable should be the name as given in the data, that is the shape name. So now it's time to pass the property. So we can see that over here the property variables of a type class property. So for that, what we need to do is we can pass something called property, and instead of directly passing the shape data of property, we need to call the property class, and we need to call from JSON function, and from the JSON function we are going to send the shape data with the property. So now this function returns the property in the term of class. So now let's try to output this data. So what we need to do is we need to send the data to the outermost class. So in order to call that, we have to return the shape class and not the property class. So we need to call shape.from JSON, and the shape data is simply the data that we are going to pass. And now inside the function we are going to say variable value is the value returned from the getData function, and let's try to print the value. So now let's see what output we are going to get. So now we have instance of shape. So now let's try as normal what we have done in our previous files or the previous section. So we need to call the shape name and we need to call the property. So let's try to call shape name, and we'll try to call the along with the shape name we have the property. So we'll just call the property function. So let's try what we get over here. So now if I just run this, so over here for the shape name we have got rectangle, but for the instance, for the property, we have got the instance of property. So how do I get the width and breadth? That's really simple. Just add the tag of dot width from the property class, because this is instance of property. So instance of property contains two variables, that is the width and breadth. So if I try to run this program once again, I have to get the shape and the width. So we are getting the width. So the first thing is the rectangle, and then we are getting the width as well. So we have successfully passed level 3 JSON data as well. So now it's time to go to the level 4. So now the level 4 is a little bit confusing, because what we have is we have a JSON data. So this data contains ID of integer, name of string, these two are not a problem, but images is a list. So again, it's a list of a JSON data. So now this contains ID and image name. So now let's try to parse this. So now let me just copy this, and I'm going to create a new folder, that is a new file, and we'll name it as level4.dart. So we have named this as level4.dart. So we, as usual, will create a main function which says that we are in level 4. Cool. So now as usual we'll create a getData function, and we'll store this value in a variable called data, as we have done previously. So let me just add some commas just to format these things. So now we have formatted everything. So now it's time to format this as well. So here is the formatted data. So now what we are going to do is we have a variable. So now what I want you guys to do is just pause the video for a minute and try to pass yourself. So if you can pass, then do comment that you have understood, like how you have passed, like how you have actually passed it, and that you have successfully passed without any issues. And if you are still not able to pass it, then there's no worries, you can just follow up this video so that you can learn exactly like how you are going to pass. So now while we are going to create a class, we need to create it from the innermost nested structure. So the innermost over here is this JSON data. So this JSON data is of a contains two variables, that is ID, which is of a type int, and image name, which is of a type string. So now let's create a class which states it as image. So we have the image class, right? So the image class takes ID in the form of integer. So we'll say it as int ID, and it takes the image name in the form of string. So we'll say image name, and let's, as usual, we'll create a constructor with ID and image name. So now it's time to create the factory method, and I guess you now actually know how we are going to create the factory method. So let's create a factory method, that is image.fromJSON from JSON. So now let's see the type of data that we are going to pass. That is of a type map. mapping, because if it's the JSON data then it's a map. And then we have the string and dynamic value. Dynamic in the sense it can take a string, it can take integer, it can take any type. So we are saying that this is a string and this can take any type. So we are saying that we have a map which takes the key value as string and value can be anything. So it's a dynamic, and we'll say image data. And now we need to return this as a form of image class. So we'll just say image, and now instead of id we are going to say image data of id, and instead of image name we are going to say image data of image name. So this is what you have done. So now we have done with the innermost class. So now it's we have to do with the outermost class. So the if you see the contents, that is we have a id of a type int, we have a name of a type string, and we have an image that is a list of some JSON type. So what we need to do is, now let's create a variable for the class for this outermost JSON data. So what we can name this, let's name this as post. So we'll say a class post which contains int in the form, or id in the form of int, which contains final, I think it's the name in the form of string, and now comes a list. So it says a list of image, and we'll say it as images. This image class refers to this class over here. So now let's try to create a that is a constructor for this. So we have this dot id, we have this dot name, and we have this dot images. So we have done with this. So now it's time to create the function, that is we need to create a factory method. So let's create factory method. It says post dot from JSON, and it's of a type map as usual, and it has to be a string comma dynamic. So we'll say post data, and now we need to return this as a post class. So we'll just say post, and we'll just say over here it as id, we have post data, and from there we have id, we have name post data of name. But now if we come to the images, it's just not the list, we have to convert it into a list of the class image. So what we can do is inside the factory method we can create a new list. So variable we can say it as image list. Now we get the images from the post data. So post data of images is a list. So we are going to map each material we are going to map it. So before that we'll make it as a list, we'll get it as a list, so this is capital, and now we'll say it as image list is image list dot map function. So for each mapping, that is for each element, what we need to do is we need to call the image function from JSON, and we need to pass e. So what the map function does is from the image list, so we'll say it as image itself, So from the image list, we are directly getting it as from the posted images, and we are storing it as a list. And from the image list, what we are going to do is we are going to map through each element, and each list, that is for the first map, this element will be converted into a class of image and will be stored inside this list, inside the image list. And for the second map, this function, this data will be passed, and it will be converted into a image class that is containing id and image, and it will be stored in the image list. So now this image list is of a type list of image. So in just the sense, we can say it as list of image, because it's a list of the type image class. So now, as the images says, it's of a type image list of images, we can just say it as image list as this. So now we need, in the get data function, we need to call the outermost class with the JSON function. So now let's try to call, and we call and return the JSON function from the post class from JSON, and we are going to pass the data. So now let's try. So what we'll do is we'll say variable value will have the then by get data, and now let's try to print value. So let's see what output we are going to get. So now we can see over here we have got some exception. The error was we need to convert this as to list, and now we can have this as image list. So now if we try to run this program is, so we have to get the output right now. So we have got instance of post as usual, because we need to get the instance of this class. So now we know that if we try to print out id or name, we are going to get. But let's see what happens if we try to print out the images. So for the reference, I'll just print name, and over here print value dot, we have images. So let's try to run this right now. So now we get a list of instance of images. So now we can go to the first image, and from there we can have something called as id. So now we should get the output as 11. So let's try that. So now we can see we have the product name, and we have the id as 11 as well. So our parsing has been done successful. So over here the thing was we had to map each list, and then we had to explicitly convert that into a list and then store it inside a variable. So this variable is of a type the list of images. So now we have done with the level 4 parsing also. So now it's time to head on to the level 5. So the level 5, we can see we have, first we have a list, and then we have direct, we have a normal JSON file, that is a JSON format. So now let's copy this, and let's try to parse the final and the complex one that we have taken for this video. So we'll just create a new file, we'll name it as level5.dart. So before continuing to level 5, if you guys have not still subscribed to this channel, then please do subscribe to this channel, and also click on the bell button so that you can receive the notifications of all the new videos from this channel. So now let's continue to our 5th level. So we'll just print as level 5. Okay, we are in level 5. So now as usual we'll just proceed on with our initial setup. So I know I could have just copied it, but we'll try to make it from scratch as every time. So I have done this, formatted the entire data. So now we have only one class, that is of the album class. So we can just create one class, and now let's create a class called album, and this has an album id as a string, sorry, it is as an int, so we'll say final int album id. Then we have id in the form of int, that is just id. Then we have title in the form of string, so final string title. Next we have final url in the form of string, and we have thumbnail url again, so we'll say final, that is in the form of string. We'll name it as thumbnail url itself. So now let's create a class for this, as there's a constructor for this as well. So it says this dot album id, we have this dot id, oh, so now let's create a factory method for this as well. So the factory method takes the album, and we are going to pass a from Json function, which is of the type map string dynamic, and we'll say album data, and here we are going to return it in the form of album class. So inside the album id will be album data of album id. We have id in the form of album data of id. We have title in the form of album data of title. Let me just finish it off really quick. So we have album id of url, and we have thumbnail url. So this is album data of, we have thumbnail url. So we have created a class. So now if we just try to look at the structure, so this is a list of album. So now we need to create a second class that contains a list of all these albums. So for that we can create a new class called as album list. So it contains a list of albums. So final so it is a final list of album class, and let's say it as albums. Okay, so let's say it as albums. So now we need to create a constructor for the album list class. So it says that this dot albums. So now we need to pass the factory method. So now it says album list dot from Json. So now here we need to see what type of data we are going to pass. So we are going to call the list. So it is a list and not this is a list and not a map function as previous. So over here we need to call list, and it can be of the type, it is of a type album, but we will specify as dynamic, so it can take any type, and we'll say album list data. So now we have created this, and over here now we need to return the entire list. So for that what we can do is we'll just delete this. So what we can do is we can make a list of new albums. So we'll say variable album, So as what you have done in the level 4, I guess. So we have done in the level 4 for this function, so we are going to copy that itself. So we are going to get the values from the album list data. It contains the uh, data. So this data is itself a list. So what we can do is we can just say map. We can map each function, and from each value we are going to return the album. We are going to say album dot from JSON. We are going to pass es data, and this is converted to list. So we have converted this to list. So now it's time to return the album list. So we are going to return. So this contains albums, and that will be album. So now let's try to run this. So before running, we need to call the album list. So we need to return album list dot from JSON, and we need to send the data. So it's we have to say return from the album list from JSON. We are passing this list of data. So now let's try over here to get the values, and now let's try to print val, and let's see what we get. So we have a run function over here itself. So we get an instance of album list. So now we get an instance of album. So let's try to get from that we'll just get albums, because that's a list. So instance of class, so in that class we have album, instance of album list. So instance of album list reference to album. So if we just print out albums, we have this. So now we are getting 3 albums. So now let's go on to the first album, that is using the index 0, and from there let's get the title. I want the title of the album. That's it. So let's try this. Oh yeah, we have got the title. So what happens if I just say URL? So that's it, guys. You have learned how you're going to pass JSON data in Dart of Flutter application. So in the next video, we'll be seeing how we can fetch the data from the remote websites or from a server, and then we can pass that JSON data in Dart. And also we are going to see how we can implement those things in our actual Android application. So if you like this video, then do subscribe to this channel, and also click on the bell button so that you can receive the notifications of all the new videos from this channel. Thank you for watching. Meet you in the next video.